So the fixed mindset and the growth mindset are two different ways of living life, and they each are self-perpetuating. Or as Henry Ford is once quoted as saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So if you have a fixed mindset, you end up proving yourself right all the time. Like, look, see that? Joe can't give a presentation to save his life. Like, he just screwed up another one. However, if you have a growth mindset, you are looking for those changes. And so you also make that prophecy come to pass, right? Like, you give Joe feedback and you tell him, here's one thing you could do differently. And you see Joe do that one thing differently and you prove yourself right about that.
Hey guys, welcome to the Millennial Mastermind Podcast. For today's show, I wanted to dig one of my absolute favorite episodes out of the archives. This one was originally posted way back in December of 2016 with the amazing Angela Duckworth as our guest. Angela is a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, the founder and scientific director of the Character Lab, the recipient of the 2013 MacArthur Genius Award, and in what she is most recently known for, she is the author of the New York Times bestseller Grit: The Power of Passion and Perseverance, which if you haven't read it, it's just an amazing book that I encourage everybody to check out. But it's an episode that I wanted to either share for the first time with those of you who have started listening to the show more recently, or to dust off and reshare with those of you who heard it way back when, because it's definitely one that withstands the test of time. And frankly, it's a message that I needed to re-listen to as well. So while I may sound 2 years younger and almost 90 episodes less experienced, Angela steals the show here and delivers incredible and timeless value. So with that, please enjoy this past episode with Angela Duckworth. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so excited for this interview today. I am sitting next to really an inspirational figure for me personally. I first heard her TED Talk about a year ago. Never had any inkling that I'd have the opportunity to actually meet her in person. Read her book when it came out and was very inspired, then saw that she was coming to Cleveland and had to get onto that opportunity. And I, as I mentioned in the introduction, am sitting next to none other than Angela Duckworth. Angela, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you. It's nice to meet you, Brad.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making the time to talk with me and share some of your insights with my audience. I know that people are going to be so thrilled to hear about this, and if they haven't already read your book, then they'll get on it pretty quickly based on this. Going back into your background a little bit, you've been a McKinsey consultant, a public school teacher, you're now a professor, you founded and you're the scientific director at the Character Lab, and you've written the book, Grit: The Power of Passion and Perseverance. I usually like to ask guests to give the Cliff Note version of their background, but I'm not even sure how that would start for you. But
you did a pretty good job, and I didn't do all those things at once.
Right.
So it sounds more impressive when they're all in the same sentence, separated by commas. But I'm so excited about the work I do. I think it gives me a lot of energy.
That's all we can ask for in this world, right?
Yeah, it's a blessing.
So, what would be, for those who haven't read the book, haven't seen you speak, haven't really heard about the grit movement, what would be your Cliff Note version or your elevator pitch for grit and what that means?
Grit is a quality that I define as the combination of passion and perseverance over a long period of time. So not just loving what you do, but also working really, really hard at it over really, I think when you're talking about young adulthood or middle adulthood and not kids, I'm really talking about years, if not decades.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so reading through the book, one of the things that really caught my attention early on in it, and it was a theme throughout the book, was the importance of effort in whatever it is that you're working on. And like you said, over those decades.
And the idea of the treadmill test I found just so fascinating, so interesting. Would you mind explaining a little bit what the treadmill test is and what some of your findings were around that?
There are two historical references to the treadmill test. One is that Harvard University had what they called the Harvard Fatigue Laboratory. And early in the 20th century, Harvard decided to put young men who were undergraduates at Harvard on a treadmill and asked them to stay on it as long as they could. Now, they cranked up the treadmill to a sufficient incline and ramped up the speed such that, some men could only hang on for a minute and a half.
Oh my gosh.
And I think they ended the trial at something like 5. It was really, really tough. And the interesting finding from that study is that when you then follow those men into adulthood and you ask the question, well, how are they doing at middle age? Are they in a stable romantic relationship? Are they working? How many days sick have they taken in the last year? Are they mentally healthy? That the number of seconds that you could hang on to that treadmill predicted all of those outcomes, even when you control for how healthy physically those young men were when they got on. So it wasn't just a physical test or an athletic test. It seemed to be something of a psychological test.
Okay.
And actually the scientists behind that who wrote up the report, even in the early years before they knew what would happen to these men, all those decades later, said from go, you know what, this is not just a test of your athletic ability, this is a test of your will. So that's the first historical reference, and it's interesting that we sometimes use treadmill as a metaphor, but there was a Harvard study. And the second historical reference is much more recent, and that is Will Smith, who a couple of decades ago said in an interview that the only thing that sets him apart from other people who are trying to become successful is that he will never get off the treadmill before you will.
Yeah.
And so that is the reference that I actually prefer, because I know what he means, and he's obviously using it metaphorically. It's not to say that other things don't matter. It's not to say that luck doesn't matter, or opportunity, or talent, right? How gifted you are at something, but there is no substitute for sticking with something with all of your heart and doing it consistently over long stretches of time.
Right. And I think that metaphor is a really easy one for people to grasp, because we've all been on a treadmill at some point in our life, and it is so easy to hit that stop button and just quit right there. It's not like you're a mile away from your home where you have to run back. It's literally at your fingertips, the ability to stop it and step off. And so I found that to be really interesting, how it ties in then to, like you mentioned, how these individuals in the future were in their lives and their relationships just had such an impact and such foretold and foreshadowed what was ahead for them. So that really, I thought that one was very, very interesting. Another point that is a big theme within the book, obviously the title being The Power of Passion and Perseverance, was the concept of passion. And this is one that I think with my millennial audience is something that some people know right off the bat what their passion is, but as you explained really well in the book, sometimes it's a process of discovering what that passion is, and you grow into that passion. So I was hoping you could just share some of your thoughts on that, especially for a young audience who may not know what that passion is and is sick of hearing people say, just follow your passions. And they're like, well, I want to, but it's not that I don't want to. It's just, I'm not sure how to find it.
I have a lot of sympathy for millennials. I think millennials get beaten up unfairly by older adults who, by the way, every time I give a talk and I show a graph of grit and age, I hasten to point out that though the graph is upward sloping, so the older adults in my samples, the 30, 40, 50-year-olds tend to be grittier than younger adults. I remind the audience that the millennials are not just young people who grew up in a different culture, right? Because that's what makes you millennials, that you grew up in the new millennium. Right. But you're young. I mean, and so sometimes the 45-year-old who's a little frustrated with the 24-year-old that they just hired, and, the 24-year-old doesn't know everything that they don't want to stay past 6 o'clock, and they're not focused on what they really want to do. Well, that's partly because of life experience. I think the graph is upward sloping in part because, as you develop your interests and you make mistakes and you learn from them, you will become more gritty over time. And sometimes it's easy to forget all of those hard-fought lessons, and all you have to do is, shake your head. You shouldn't just shake your head at a millennial and say like, oh gosh, I was not like that when I was there, because you may be actually just like that, or you may have been at that age. I think it's rare, honestly, for people to know what their calling is when they're your age. I think there are some people for whom, fortunately, they figured it out very early in life. But for most people, they are spending that period of young adulthood in the process of developing a passion. And I think it's absolutely the right language to say, develop and deepen your passion. It's less helpful to tell people that it's simply a process of discovery, because then they'll have this idea that they should just try stuff. And if it doesn't feel like passion within 6 or 7 days, they should move on to the next thing. And I think there are so many young people that I see, that I've hired, that I've mentored, where they feel this deep insecurity. They ask me almost ashamed, like, I don't know if this is my passion. I was like, well, you're not supposed to know if it's your passion. It's not like that. It's a process. It can take a long time. Some of the people that I've interviewed kind of happenstance ended up being, well, it ended up that, the only course that I could take, I'm thinking, for example, of Al Bandura, who's the most cited living psychologist in history. He's at Stanford University, and his story for how he became a psychologist is that because the course that he wanted to take, and the time that he wanted to take it, happened, like the only thing he could take was psychology. He didn't want to, but he did. And, ended up that he got more and more and more into it over the years.
Right.
It didn't kind of happen in a flash of insight. And I think that if you have patience with yourself, you can say, look, it's not that anybody could be anything and have passion, but there are many things that could become passions for you, and you can't predict from the beginning. Why don't you just get more and more into things? And the one piece of advice that I would give any millennial is this: whether you're in your calling or your future calling or not, come to work every day and just be amazing. I mean, just be like the best possible worker bee that you can be. Anticipate things that people didn't ask you to do and do them, like go over and beyond. If you continually do that, I think that you'll find that a lot of these problems work out on their own, and wherever you go, someone will want to hire you.
Okay. Yeah, no, I love that advice. And so if somebody is in a career path and they've been at it, for 1 or 2 years, so not too long in the grand scheme of things, and they're really just not feeling it, and they're starting to question themselves, could this develop into something I'm more interested in more passionate in the long run? Like, how do you know when to quit? When's the right time to make a transition to something new, to try something new on the side? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a really, really good question, and there's no straightforward rule of thumb. If it's blue, do this. If it's yellow, do that. But here are some thoughts. One is that I think the rational thing to do when there's a better path is to take the better path. So there's no shame in quitting if there is actually something else that you can do. In fact, that is the one good reason to quit anything, which is that I could be doing something else that's better for me, more worthwhile. I think a lot of times people quit for other reasons, like this is painful right now, right? Like I'm nervous. This is hard. Those are all reasons that I don't think are worthwhile for quitting. But plan B is a better plan. That's a great reason. Now, how do you know that plan B is actually better than plan A, which is where you are?
Right. The grass is always greener, right?
Yeah. How do you, right. Is the grass always green? Like sometimes the grass is greener, right?
Yeah.
So the question is like, how do I get over to the greener grass? But how do I know the difference? Again, I don't know that there's a kind of rule of thumb that works every time, but here are some thoughts. One is that, if you have 2 or 3 people that know you pretty well and have your best interests at heart and have some maybe more life experience than you do, I think asking them their opinion. We know ourselves, but often we have the lack of perspective to really see what is best for us. Or, there could be somebody in our life who would say, look, let me tell you, really, I know you. I've known you since you were 6 years old. Like, try this other thing. I've seen where your interests are and where your eyes light up. So I would say ask 2 or 3 trusted advisors.
Okay.
They don't have to be official mentors. They could be your parents, frankly.
Right.
Your best friend, an old college professor. See if that helps. I'd say. And the second thing I would say is that, a lot of times people are not as creative as they could be. I'm not saying that everybody has to keep the job that they have when they're 26 years old. In fact, most 26-year-olds will not keep that job forever. But I sat on the plane on my way to see you, next to this guy, and I asked him the question that I love to ask people on planes and trains, which is, do you love what you do? And without hesitation, he said yes. Turns out he's in some kind of, engineering, defense contracting, and he told me about it in detail. And wow, this guy really does love what he does.
It's a good conversation starter.
It was.
Or conversation ender if it's the other direction.
Yeah, well, people like to talk about it either way, actually, interestingly. And the thing is that guy's been doing it for most of his adult life. I don't know that when he was a young man, he knew that he was eventually going to be that excited about it. But one thing that makes your calling, and he did say it was a calling for him. He feels like it's a vocation, really, not just a career or a job, is that he brings himself to it. So he is making it his calling, right? So he is, really interested in, he said maybe one regret is that I could have actually served my country in the military, and then he went on at length to tell me about how his engineering company actually does do work for the military and how in its way makes the country a safer place. So bring yourself to work. If you love cooking, does that mean that you have to only do it at, 6:00 when you get home? Is there a way that make a meal for the people who you work with? Bring your passion into your work and don't always expect it to come, completely, on a platter for you, your job has every element in it that you feel excited about.
That makes a lot of sense. And I love what you said about having, some trusted advisors, as you put it. And they don't have to be formal mentors, like you said. And one concept that the name kind of lends itself that we talk to a lot is mastermind groups and finding people that you could surround yourself with who have similar goals to you, who can help you, who have done things that you want to do, like-minded individuals. And I feel that they could probably serve in that role as well in helping you to navigate some of those waters. And it brings up another point from the book where you talk about creating a culture of grit around us. And I found that really interesting because I've been in a few different organizations, some that you could feel the culture of grit and people wanting to, really push ahead and make a difference. Others where there was just a lot of complacency and really were not that motivating. And I could just, by reading your chapter on that, just say, wow, that was not a culture of grit. Is there a way using the people around you, if you're in a situation that isn't necessarily gritty and moving the needle for you in that way in your job or the people you're around every day, is there a way that outside of that you can build a culture of grit, whether with, mentors or mastermind group or family or something like that?
Well, I think there are limits, right? So if you're in a company where the culture seems to be one of complacency, or, how do we do the least amount of work and get out of here, right, before 5:00? There's only so much that you, as a relatively junior person, assuming, right, can do. But I think there is always microcultures, right? So, for example, when I think back to my college days, there was certainly the culture of the campus and the university, but really what mattered was my 4 roommates, right? Because my life was all about these people that I saw every day, and it didn't have as much to do with the norms of this big campus that I was on. And so if you are a relatively junior person in a culture that doesn't sing for you, maybe you can think about how you can change your microculture, right?
Okay.
The people that you see every day. And I think one thing that's very powerful about human nature and a lesson that all of us can take no matter what age is the principle of reciprocity. If you walk into a room and you smile at the person and you are incredibly warm and energetic, just by the principle of reciprocity, that person is also going to smile back,
right,
and kind of react to your emotional timber in the way that is resonant. And so you can set the tone proactively. If you start bringing in, bagels on Mondays, which nobody ever asked you to do, and you don't get reimbursed, and you just watch what happens. Someone's going to start bringing something in on Thursdays.
Yeah.
So I think there is some room to make a microculture to be something that you would thrive in. That said, given that there are constraints and you ideally want to be in a macro culture that you also love, that again, like, I don't think 26-year-olds should feel like that the job that they're in is necessarily the one that they're always going to be in.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. Well, and then moving topics a little bit to more of an individual mindset approach. Another thing that you talk a lot about is having a growth mindset. And I think that that's something for my personal journey that I had in college. I came out of college.
You had a growth mindset in college.
Well, a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, I wanted to better myself. I did a lot of extracurricular activities, was in leadership roles in different organizations, networked. And then I got out of college and I was kind of overwhelmed by the quote unquote real world, did my 9 to 5, would go home. And then that was done. I unplugged, I watched TV, whatever it was. And then it took a couple years until I really realized that wasn't going to get me to where I wanted to be. That wasn't going to take me to the next level of my life. That's when I started reading more personal development books, started listening to more podcasts, and which all ultimately led to starting my own. And I think that that's a thing that I see a lot of my peers and coworkers struggle with, is they still don't have a growth mindset or that willingness or desire, because I don't know if they've been introduced to it.
Yeah.
And so I would love if you would talk a little bit about it, and if people don't see themselves as having a strong growth mindset, how they can improve upon
how they do that, right? So actually, on the same plane, so the guy to my left was the engineer who loved his work, who felt like he had a calling. The guy to my right was reading Growth Mindset, actually Carol Dweck's book. So
wow.
I can tell your readers what he was reading and who Carol Dweck is. So Carol Dweck is a psychologist at Stanford University. She's been studying people's beliefs, their theories about how the world and how human nature really work. And the growth mindset that she refers to is the theory that human nature is essentially designed for growth and for adaptation and for learning. The opposite of that would be a fixed mindset, where you believe that human beings are essentially who they are and they don't change much, and there's nothing you can really do. So why would you read a book for personal development? Why would you go to a workshop? Mm-hmm. Why would you ever expect somebody that you hire to be different from when you hired them? And so the fixed mindset and the growth mindset are two different ways of living life, and they each are self-perpetuating. Or as Henry Ford is once quoted as saying, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So if you have a fixed mindset, you end up proving yourself right all the time. Like, look, see that? Joe can't give a presentation to save his life. Like, he just screwed up another one. However, if you have a growth mindset, you are looking for those changes. And so you also make that prophecy come to pass, right? Like, you give Joe feedback and you tell him, here's one thing you could do differently. And you see Joe do that one thing differently, and you prove yourself right about that. Mm-hmm. So the final thing I would say about growth mindset is that I think it may be one of the most powerful ideas to come out of modern psychological science in my lifetime. And there's a reason why every CEO, and I'm not exaggerating, every CEO I have ever interviewed has a dog-eared copy of Growth Mindset. So you should buy her book. You can buy mine too, and there's a chapter on mindset and hope, but you should absolutely buy Carol's. And it is actually malleable. So one of the most important things that Carol has discovered is that you can change a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, in part by confronting the scientific facts. The brain is plastic. We do learn throughout the lifespan. There's no trait, including grit, that is ever fixed. And so if you want to believe that you can change, then there is a preponderance of scientific evidence on your side.
Well, I strongly urge anybody who's listening to go and check out Grit, because there is the chapter in there about it, and Growth Mindset we'll definitely link up to that in the show notes as well. Before I ask you the final question though, if people are really interested in this stuff and they're drinking the Kool-Aid right now, the Angel Duckworth Kool-Aid, where can they find out more about you and go to check out the book and all of that fun stuff on the web?
You can learn more from my website, which is www.angeladuckworth.com. And you can learn also, if you have a particular interest in kids, I started a nonprofit called Character Lab, and that is www.characterlab.org. And videos from Carol Dweck and other scientists who are really doing work that can make kids' lives better, they're all there and they're free.
Great. And so the final question, and we'll have all those things linked up on the show notes at millennialmm.com. But the last question that I love to ask guests as they come on the show is, if you could hop into a time machine and go back to talk to yourself when you're in, your younger to mid-20s, you're in that McKinsey consulting position maybe, before you had gone on to teaching and to even starting to think about grit, what advice would you give to yourself at that point in your career? You
know why I love this question? This is actually, we run an intervention where people write letters to themselves, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, or to others. It's a fantastic question. It gives you a little psychological distance on yourself.
Yeah.
I was very unhappy when I was a millennial, or I guess I was never a millennial. When I was in my young 20s and even through my mid-20s, I was so unhappy. I cried a lot. I wondered whether I would ever find a guy that I would want to marry. I wondered whether I'd ever have kids. I wondered whether I would ever make anything of my ambition. I felt lonely a lot. I didn't feel satisfied about my friendships. There's so much angst and suffering. And I guess I would say, just it's going to get better. Mm-hmm. Have patience, and in fact, that is actually what I think young adults need to hear. All of the graphs of what happens to you after your 20s. How does your emotional stability look? What about your grit? What about your dependability? How do your relationships look? They all go up. So you have everything to look forward to.
That's great to hear, and that's an awesome note to wrap it up on. So, Angela, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, to share your message with my guests, and I know that everybody's going to take a lot out of this one, so thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It was really fun.